I'm Maddie Lawson, 28 years old, and 3 months ago, my mother looked me in the eye during a family meeting and shouted, "You're ungrateful. Get out and never come back." No one said a word after that, just the sound of my heartbeat and the tick of the kitchen clock. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My brother slouched on the couch, pretending to scroll through his phone. I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked out of the house I'd helped keep afloat for years. No door slam, no tears, just the clean sound of footsteps leaving behind every guilt and debt they ever hung around my neck. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been blamed for holding your family together while they watched you fall apart. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Indianapolis in a one-story house my parents always called the Lawson Legacy. It wasn't fancy, but Mom guarded it like a trophy of survival. Dad worked at an auto parts warehouse, clocking overtime shifts that left his hands rough and his back bent. Mom stayed home until my brother was born, then started selling homemade candles online and called herself an entrepreneur. We weren't rich, but we had enough. What I didn't understand then was that love in our house was measured in usefulness. Whoever solved the crisis of the week was the favorite until the next one came along. From the time I was old enough to balance a checkbook, I became the family's quiet solution. When the water heater broke, I picked up weekend shifts at the diner. When Evan's college tuition came due, I took out a small loan and told everyone it was a scholarship. My parents thanked me in passing, but never forgot to remind me how lucky I was to have such a good head on my shoulders. Evan, on the other hand, was sensitive. He bounced from major to major, job to job, always finding himself. Whenever he failed, Mom said he just needed time. Whenever I succeeded, she said I was too focused on money. The double standard became the rhythm of our family dinners, praise for him, pressure for me. By the time I was 23, I'd graduated, early landed a job in corporate finance, and was sending part of every paycheck home. The first time the mortgage fell behind, I wired a few thousand without hesitation. Dad promised they'd pay me back once things evened out. They never did. Each time I tried to step back, another crisis surfaced: a dental bill, a car repair, a missed insurance payment. I told myself it was temporary, that once Evan got steady work, the weight would shift. But it never did. My mother's requests came dressed as guilt trips. "You know we'd help you if we could, sweetheart," or "Your brother's trying his best, don't make him feel small." I stopped arguing because arguing only made me the villain. Still, I kept giving. I covered bills quietly and celebrated holidays like everything was fine. But somewhere along the way, something inside me started to crack. I noticed how easily my parents praised Evan for taking out the trash while ignoring the months I paid the utilities. I noticed how their tone changed whenever I mentioned saving for my own place. They'd glance at each other and Mom would say, "You have plenty of time to think about yourself later." That sentence felt like a leash. It was a Sunday afternoon when the shift finally began. We were supposed to be having our usual family check-in, Mom's idea of keeping communication open. Evan was complaining about how stressful it was being between jobs again. I was half listening, sipping coffee, when Mom suddenly turned to me. "At least someone in this house isn't completely selfish," she said. I froze, unsure who she meant, until she added, "You've been cold lately, Maddie. We raised you better than this." I remember the scrape of my mug against the table, the hum of the refrigerator, and the hollow feeling of realizing that in her eyes everything I'd done counted for nothing. I swallowed my words because experience had taught me that defending myself only invited another lecture. That silence became the seed of the family meeting, a few weeks later, the one that would end everything. Dad sent a group text saying we should all sit down and talk. I went thinking maybe it was about reconciliation. Instead, it was about the mortgage again. Mom stood behind the kitchen island with a folder clutched like evidence. Evan lounged on the couch, smirking. They had already decided what they wanted before I walked through the door. When they told me I needed to cover the entire mortgage from now on, I almost laughed. I had already been paying half for a year. I asked about Evan contributing, and Mom snapped the folder shut. "Don't throw that in his face. He's trying." In that moment, the air changed. I looked from one to the other and realized this wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush. Dad leaned forward saying, "Families support each other." I answered quietly, "Families don't manipulate each other." That's when Mom shouted the words that ended everything. "You're ungrateful. Get out and never come back." I remember standing there, hearing my pulse in my ears, waiting for someone to stop her. No one did. So I picked up my bag and left. Not a single word, not a backward glance. Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel, and the air smelled like rain. I walked to my car with a calm that felt foreign, like it belonged to someone braver than me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't their fixer. I was just me, and I didn't owe them anything. But what I didn't know then was that freedom comes with an echo. And before long, that silence I thought was peace would start to ring with the sound of their panic, pulling me back toward a truth I'd been avoiding for years. The first few days after I walked out of my parents' house felt almost weightless. I stayed with my friend Claire for a week, sleeping on her pull-out couch, eating takeout, and trying to understand what life looked like without someone else's bills hanging over my head. I woke up one morning to the sound of rain against the window and realized I had nowhere to be, but work no family crisis to fix, no late-night transfer to make. It was quiet, unfamiliar, and exactly what I needed. When my first paycheck arrived after that blow-up, I opened my account and saw more money than I'd had in months. For once, I didn't move it anywhere. I paid off a lingering credit card balance, bought groceries that didn't come with guilt, and started looking for my own place. 2 weeks later, I found a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just an older building with creaky floors, mismatched blinds, and a balcony barely big enough for a chair. But when I signed the lease, something in me settled. It was mine. Moving day was quiet. Claire helped carry boxes, and by afternoon the apartment smelled like pizza and cardboard. I remember standing in the middle of the living room watching the sunlight crawl across the wall, realizing that for the first time since college, every object in that room had been paid for with my own effort. There were no reminders taped to the fridge about payments due, no stack of envelopes waiting to be opened, no voices arguing in the next room about money. Just stillness. The first nights were the hardest. My body was used to chaos. Silence made me restless. I'd wake up expecting my phone to light up with missed calls or guilt-soaked messages, but there was nothing. No apology, no update, not even a half-hearted hope you're doing okay. That absence was supposed to punish me. Instead, it became proof of what I already knew. Their love had always been conditional. Days turned into weeks, and life began to feel almost normal. I joined my coworkers for lunch instead of rushing home to check my parents' utilities account. I stopped skipping meals to cover emergencies. I even started taking evening walks after work, letting the air clear my thoughts. My therapist called it reclaiming space. I called it breathing. Then on a quiet Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed while I was pouring coffee. It was a text from Dad. "Hey, did you already send this month's mortgage payment?" I stared at the screen, reading the words twice before they sank in. No greeting. No question about how I was doing. Just business as usual, as if the screaming match that drove me out had been erased. I set the cup down and watched the steam rise. A small part of me had expected this moment, maybe not so soon, but eventually. I thought of the empty chairs around that kitchen island of Mom's cold voice and the way my father had looked away while she threw me out. I let the phone buzz again before typing, "Oh, I thought I wasn't welcome anymore." 3 dots appeared on the screen, then vanished, then came back. For a minute I could almost hear him pacing. Then messages began to flood in, first from him, then from Mom, then from Evan. "This isn't the time to be petty. We need your help, Maddie," the bank called. "You're destroying the family just to prove a point." I put the phone face down on the counter and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered in the drizzle, and people hurried to their cars. Somewhere out there, everyone was chasing their own version of peace. Mine was standing still. By noon, the messages had multiplied, calls, voicemails, group chats that lit up like alarms. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I needed to understand what was really happening. Something about their panic felt rehearsed, like the old rhythm was returning, guilt, then blame, then pressure, until I gave in. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the hum of the refrigerator, trying to piece together the pattern. The mortgage had been late before, but not like this. If they were desperate enough to text me after cutting me off, something had been brewing long before I left. By morning, I decided I needed the truth. It took 3 transfers and 15 minutes on hold before someone at the bank finally answered. I gave them the account number I'd used for online payments and explained that I had helped manage the mortgage for my parents, but needed to confirm where things stood. The woman on the other end hesitated. Her voice softened as she said, "I can't share full details, but I can tell you the account has been delinquent for several months." My stomach dropped. "How many months?" I asked. There was another pause. "Looks like partial payments only for the last 8 months. 8 months. Even when I was sending money, they hadn't paid the full amount." After the call, I sat in silence for a long time. The pieces began to fit together, the sudden new patio furniture Evan posted about online, the spa weekend. Mom bragged about the vague excuses whenever I asked if things were stable. They hadn't used my money to save their home. They'd been spending it while letting the house sink further into debt. I opened my banking app and scrolled through months of transfers, thousands of dollars labeled family mortgage utilities. I added them up until the number blurred. Then I thought about every weekend shift I'd picked up to send those payments, every night I'd skip dinner so I wouldn't overdraft. All of it wasted. When Mom called that evening, I almost didn't pick up. But curiosity won. Her voice came through tight trembling like she'd been rehearsing. "Maddie, what is wrong with you? You can't just abandon your family like this." I waited until she stopped. "Where did the money go, Mom?" I asked. She paused. "What do you mean, the mortgage payments?" "The bank says they haven't been paid in full for almost a year." Her tone shifted fast. "Well, some went to bills, groceries. You know life isn't cheap." "Groceries don't cost $5,000 a month," I said quietly. She started listing other things, dental work for Dad, car repairs for Evan. Each excuse landed heavier than the last. I pictured Evan's car, the one with the new stereo system and custom rims, and felt my jaw tighten. So instead of paying the mortgage, I said, "You use the money for that." "Don't make it sound like we were reckless," she snapped. "We've sacrificed so much for you." That line had followed me my whole life. I almost smiled at how quickly it surfaced. "You didn't sacrifice," I said. "You expected me to keep paying no matter what. And now that I've stopped, everything's falling apart." There was a long silence. Then Dad's voice came through, weary, practiced. "Maddie, please. We just need help this month. Just enough to stop the bank from taking the house. We'll fix things after that." I exhaled slowly. "Fix things? You've been saying that for years. What's not fair is being thrown out of a house I helped pay for, then blamed for its collapse." Another pause. Then Mom, softer now. "We didn't mean to lie. We were scared. We thought if we told you you'd stop helping. So you lied to keep the money coming," I said. "We didn't see another way." I let the quiet stretch. "There's always another way. You just didn't want it. You wanted me." When Dad started to speak again, I cut him off. "Sell the house, Dad. Figure it out like adults. I'm done being your bailout plan." "But this is our family home," Mom began. "And you threw me out of it," I said. The line went dead quiet, and I ended the call. The next 2 days passed without a word. No calls, no texts, no apologies. Just stillness, the kind that fills a room after a storm. I cleaned the apartment, organized my receipts, and tried to let the tension drain out of my body. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground under my feet belonged to me. On the 3rd morning, a text arrived from Evan. "Thanks a lot, Maddie. They're talking about moving in with me now. Hope you're happy." I stared at it, the words flat and predictable. Happy, maybe not. But resolved, absolutely. I typed back, "They kicked me out, not the other way around." 10 seconds later, he answered. "Maybe if you weren't so cold all the time, they wouldn't have to. You broke Mom." I didn't reply. I set the phone down, walked to the balcony, and looked out at the city glowing under the early light. The air felt clean, sharp, almost new. For years, I had been their safety net. Now, for the first time, I wasn't. And somewhere deep down beneath the exhaustion and the anger, that realization carried a kind of peace I hadn't felt since childhood, a quiet knowing that this time I wasn't going back. The quiet didn't last long. 2 mornings after Evan's text, I woke to the sharp ping of my phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. I thought it might be work, but when I looked, I saw my father's name filling the screen. The subject line of his email read, "Expenses please review." Inside was a long message that tried to sound professional, like a business proposal instead of a plea. He wrote that he and Mom were doing their best, that communication had broken down, and that he forgave me for how I'd handled things. Then came the spreadsheet rows of dates and numbers meant to justify why they'd fallen behind. At the top, bolded in red, was the overdue mortgage balance, followed by a note. "If you can just help this month, we'll take care of the rest." I stared at it for a long time. The politeness of it was almost worse than the yelling. It wasn't an apology, it was a tactic, a familiar one. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and created a spreadsheet of my own. I titled it Documented Transfers. One by one, I went through my online banking records, entering each payment I'd made over the past 2 years. Mortgage, utilities, groceries. It was all there month after month, color-coded and exact. The total at the bottom made my stomach turn. I'd paid more than enough to have my own small house by now, yet they'd treated me like I'd abandoned them. That afternoon, I printed the file, stapled it, and slid it into a folder labeled Records. I didn't plan to use it yet, but it felt like armor. I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite what had happened. I knew how stories like ours were told once they left the house, Mom crying about her ungrateful daughter, Dad shaking his head and saying I'd changed. But this time, I had proof. For almost a week, things were quiet again. Then on a Saturday evening, my phone buzzed with a new text from Mom. It was short, only 4 words. "We're selling the house. No greeting, no explanation, no anger. Just resignation." I read it twice before setting the phone down. There was no satisfaction in it, no victory. Only a strange, hollow calm. A few days later, I ran into my cousin Rachel at the grocery store. She was always the one relative who managed to stay neutral when the rest of the family turned tense. We talked near the produce section, surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the scent of ripe peaches. She said she'd heard from an aunt that my parents were moving into a rental near Evan's apartment. I nodded, not surprised. "They didn't tell you?" she asked gently. "No," I said. "They don't need to." Rachel looked at me for a long moment, then smiled a little. "You look lighter," she said. I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. The day the house sold, I expected it to hit harder. I thought I'd feel that old ache in my chest, the one that always came when something ended. But when I saw the listing marked sold online, there was no ache, no tears, just a deep breath that finally went all the way down. That house had held so much birthdays, late-night arguments, silent dinners, and all the unspoken rules that kept me in line. But it also held years of resentment and invisible labor. Losing it wasn't a loss. It was release. I took a drive past the neighborhood that evening, parking across the street for a minute before continuing on. The windows were already bare, the porch light gone. For a moment I remembered being 16, standing on that same porch with a tray of cookies Mom made me deliver to the neighbors, her version of a lesson in being useful. That girl had believed love could be earned through effort. I didn't anymore. Life in my apartment began to take on a rhythm. I came home to the soft hum of the heater and the smell of my own cooking. I learned how quiet peace actually sounded. Claire stopped by often with takeout or wine, sometimes bringing her dog, who seemed to sense when the air needed breaking. I started taking early walks before work, watching the sun stretch over the rooftops. The world looked the same, but my part in it felt different, smaller maybe, but finally my own. A few weeks after the sale, I received another email from Dad. It wasn't about money this time. It was an apology of sorts written in his usual careful tone. He said they were adjusting, that he hoped someday we could find common ground. At the end, he added, "Your mother still believes you'll come around once things settle." I read it twice, then deleted it. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to come around to. The bridge had already burned, and for once I wasn't the one holding the match. I spent that weekend cleaning the apartment, putting away the last few unpacked boxes. When I found the folder labeled Records on my desk, I almost threw it away. But something stopped me. Instead, I slid it into a drawer and locked it. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about memory keeping a clear record of what I'd endured and what I'd overcome. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the city lights blink against the dark. I thought about the word family and how people use it like a promise. But I'd learned it was really a choice. It's who stays when the giving stops. It's who doesn't turn love into a transaction. And sometimes it's simply the people you build around yourself when the old foundation gives way. The next morning I woke up to a small but unexpected text from Evan. "They moved out yesterday," he wrote. "House is empty." Mom cried. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window. The sky streaked pink and silver, and felt something loosen inside me. For years I'd been tangled in their storms, pulled between guilt and obligation. But now they were living their lives without me, and I was finally free to live mine. Still, there was one last thing I needed to do. I opened my banking app and removed the old transfer accounts labeled Family and Home. My hands trembled slightly as I confirmed the deletions. When the screen cleared, a small message appeared: "No linked accounts." I stared at it for a moment, realizing what it meant. For the first time in my adult life, no one could reach into my wallet through guilt or expectation. I closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to the steady hum of the heater. The world hadn't changed, but my place in it had. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I wasn't the dependable daughter who always picked up the pieces. I was just Maddie, still standing, still whole, and learning that peace isn't something you earn. It's something you allow yourself to keep. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall soft and slow against the city lights. I watched it drift past the window and thought of all the winters I'd spent under someone else's roof, measuring my worth in dollars and silence. This year would be different. I didn't know what came next, but for once that uncertainty felt like freedom. And as the snow kept falling, I realized something simple but final. Their house was gone, the debt was gone, and the version of me who believed she owed them everything was gone too. But somewhere beyond that ending, a new story was waiting, and I was finally ready to step into it. A month passed before I heard another word from them. It came on a quiet Friday morning while I was brewing coffee, the kind of morning where sunlight softened the room and made everything feel still. My phone buzzed with a message from Dad. It wasn't a greeting or an update. It was a question. "Did you change your number? Mom says you've blocked her again." I hadn't. I just stopped responding. I stared at the text for a moment, set the phone down, and went back to pouring my coffee. The truth was, silence had become its own kind of boundary. Later that afternoon, as I walked home from work, I saw a letter sticking out of my mailbox. It was handwritten, my mother's looping script on the envelope. For a second, I considered leaving it there, letting the rain that threatened in the distance take care of it. But I carried it upstairs, sat at my kitchen table, and opened it. Inside was a short note written on thick stationery, the kind she used when she wanted to sound dignified. She wrote that she and Dad were officially out of the old house. She said it was painful but necessary. She also said something that caught my eye. "You've made your point." I folded the letter once, then again, and slipped it back into the envelope. It didn't hurt like it once would have. If anything, it confirmed what I'd suspected. They hadn't learned anything. They were just regrouping, looking for a new angle. That night, I took the letter to the small fire pit behind my building and watched it burn to ash. The wind carried the pieces away, scattering them over the parking lot like a quiet ending. The next few weeks felt different. Work was steady, and my evenings had a rhythm. Simple dinners, phone calls with Claire, long walks under the streetlights. There was a peace I hadn't known in years. Still, there were moments when old habits tried to pull me back. A strange number would call and my pulse would jump. I'd see a family in a grocery store aisle and feel a pang I couldn't name. But those feelings passed as quickly as they came. Each time I reminded myself, peace doesn't need to be earned, it just needs to be protected. Then one morning in late spring, my boss, Mr. Jacobs, called me into his office. He was a tall, quiet man with silver hair and the kind of calm that made people lower their voices around him. "You've been doing solid work, Maddie," he said, flipping through a folder. "We've noticed. There's a senior analyst position opening soon. You should apply." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Promotions weren't something I chased. I'd been too busy keeping everyone else afloat to think about advancement. But now with my finances finally my own, I realized I could. I thanked him and left the office with a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time forward motion. That night, I worked late polishing my portfolio. The city outside my window glowed in soft amber light, cars passing below like moving constellations. I thought about how far I'd come since that night I left the house with nothing but a handbag and a quiet decision. I was building something again, but this time it was for me. A week later, I got another message from Evan. "Mom says you should call Dad. He's been quiet lately." No context, no reason, just that. I hesitated before typing back. If he wants to talk, he can call. 10 minutes passed before my phone rang. "Hi, honey." His voice sounded older, somehow thinner. "I didn't want to bother you. I just thought maybe we could start over." I didn't say anything right away. He cleared his throat. "We're moving into a smaller place near the lake. It's not much, but it's something." I pictured the lake. He meant green water, small cottages, a place where families picnicked in summer. I could hear in his voice that he wanted me to respond to fill the silence with forgiveness. But I didn't have words for him. "I hope it works out," I finally said. He sighed, a sound somewhere between relief and disappointment. "You're doing well, I hear," he added softly. "Your mother told me about your new apartment. We're proud of you." The words hung there awkward and late. I thanked him and ended the call. For a few minutes I sat in the quiet, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Pride from him used to mean everything to me. Now it just sounded like a line from an old play we'd both forgotten how to perform. That weekend I drove to the edge of town for groceries. On the way back I passed the street where the old house once stood. The new owners had painted the shutters blue and planted tulips along the walkway. It didn't look like ours anymore. For the first time, that didn't bother me. It felt like the house had finally been freed too. Back at home, I spent the evening reorganizing my closet, folding sweaters into neat piles. It was mundane, but it felt grounding. Somewhere between stacking boxes and hanging coats, I realized how much of my life had been spent in survival mode, responding to chaos instead of creating calm. Now my world was small but steady, and that steadiness felt like luxury. A few days later, Claire dropped by with takeout. We sat on the balcony, eating noodles from paper boxes while her dog chased shadows on the floor. "You seem different," she said after a while. "Lighter." I smiled a little. "Maybe I finally stopped trying to earn things that should have been given." She nodded, not pushing for more. That was the thing about real friends. They didn't need the whole story to understand the weight of it. As summer settled in, my days filled with quiet progress. I got the promotion at work, started a small savings account, even planned a weekend trip to the coast. Nothing extravagant, just enough to remind myself that joy didn't have to come last. Each small step forward felt like a kind of healing I hadn't expected, slow, patient, and mine to keep. Still, one evening as I locked up the office, I caught sight of a young woman waiting by the elevator, hair pulled back neatly, wearing a blazer a little too big for her shoulders. She was talking nervously to someone on the phone. "Yes, Mom, I'll transfer it tonight," she said, voice small. The words made me stop. For a moment, I saw myself years ago standing in her shoes, apologizing for never doing enough. I wanted to tell her she didn't owe anyone her peace, but the elevator doors closed before I could. When I stepped out into the night air, I looked up at the skyline glowing against the dark. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the shouting, the silence, the steady rebuild of a life I almost lost to obligation. The past hadn't disappeared. It had just stopped running my life. That night, as I sat by the window watching the city lights, my phone buzzed once more. A message from Mom appeared on the screen. "Happy birthday. Hope you're well." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you. I am." And for the first time, it was true. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, the kind that promised rain without fury. I stood at the window and let the air shift around me. Something new was coming, not another storm, but a change, quiet and certain. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that I was ready for it. 2 weeks after my birthday, the first storm of summer rolled through the city. Heavy rain rattled the windows while I worked late on a new financial report, the one that would decide whether I'd secure the next promotion. I loved the sound of rain. Now it used to mean leaky ceilings and late payments, but in my apartment, it just meant warmth and calm. Around 8, I shut my laptop, stretched, and started tidying up. That's when I saw the small red notification on my phone, a voicemail from an unknown number. I hesitated before playing it. The voice on the other end was unmistakable Mom's. "Maddie, it's your mother. We need to talk. It's important. Please don't ignore this." Her tone was measured but strained, the kind she used when trying to sound reasonable while hiding panic. I replayed it once, listening to the way she exhaled at the end, like she was swallowing words she couldn't say. Something about it felt different, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine or just another performance. I left the message unreturned and went to bed. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Please call me. It's about Dad." I sat at my desk staring at it until the screen dimmed. It had been months since they'd reached out for anything that wasn't financial. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. She answered before the first ring finished. "Maddie," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "He's not doing well." She explained that Dad had been having chest pains and shortness of breath for weeks, but he refused to see a doctor until now. The diagnosis had come back that morning, minor heart attack, stable, but resting at County General. For a moment, everything around me went quiet. Despite everything, hearing that word heart attack cut through the distance I'd built. I left work early and drove to the hospital, the rain now a thin drizzle against the windshield. The smell of antiseptic hit me as I stepped through the doors, a scent that always made time feel slower. I found his room at the end of a long corridor. Mom sat in a chair by the bed, hands clasped tightly around her purse. Dad looked smaller somehow, pale under the fluorescent light, eyes closed but breathing steady. She looked up when I entered, startled. "You came," she whispered. I nodded. There was no point in reminding her she was the one who'd called. For the next few minutes we sat in silence, listening to the soft beeping of the monitors. When he opened his eyes and saw me, something flickered there, relief, maybe shame. "Hey, kiddo," he said weakly. I pulled up a chair but didn't take his hand. "How are you feeling?" I asked. He gave a faint smile. "Better now." The nurse came in to adjust his IV and check vitals, breaking the tension for a moment. When she left, Mom exhaled heavily. "They say it could have been worse," she murmured. "He needs rest, no stress." She turned toward me, then her eyes glistening. I shouldn't have said some of the things I did. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to hold on to anger. It had been my protection for so long, but sitting there watching my father hooked to wires and machines, the weight of old resentment didn't feel as heavy as it once had. "What matters now is that he's okay," I said quietly. Over the next few days, I visited after work, bringing small things, a crossword book, a cup of coffee, a newspaper. We talked about ordinary things, sports, the weather, my job. He never brought up money, and neither did I. Once, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him staring at me with a kind of distant sadness. "You're doing well," he said one afternoon, voice steady but tired. "I heard about your promotion." "I am," I replied. "It's been peaceful." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the window. "You deserve that." Mom stayed mostly quiet during those visits, hovering in the background. She looked worn out, her usual sharpness dulled. One evening, as I stood to leave, she followed me into the hallway. "Maddie," she said softly, "I know we can't undo what happened, but maybe we can start again." I studied her face lines deeper now, eyes rimmed red. "Starting again doesn't mean forgetting." I said, "It just means being honest." She nodded, though I wasn't sure she understood what that really meant. Dad was discharged a week later with a strict list of medications and a promise to take it easy. They invited me over for dinner that weekend, their new rental near the lake. It was small but tidy, the kind of place that forced people to live closer to each other than they might prefer. I almost said no but agreed, if only to see things for myself. When I arrived, the air smelled of roast chicken and lemon cleaner. The table was set neatly, a single candle flickering in the middle. Evan was there too, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Didn't expect to see you," he said with a half smirk. "Mom said you were too busy being independent." I ignored the jab and took a seat. Dinner was polite, almost painfully so. Dad complimented my work. Mom asked about my apartment. Evan made small talk about his new job managing a warehouse. For a while, it almost felt normal. Then, as dessert plates were cleared, Mom broke the calm. "We've been thinking," she began, eyes shifting between me and Dad. "We should try family counseling, to heal." The word hung in the air. I set my fork down slowly. "Counseling?" "Yes," she said quickly. "It's time to move forward. The past is behind us, and we're still a family." I glanced at Dad. He looked uncomfortable but didn't disagree. Evan shrugged, clearly disinterested. Something about the way she said "move forward" made me realize she still didn't see the problem. She wanted peace without accountability, forgiveness without change. "I'll think about it," I said, standing to gather my things. "Maddie, please," she pressed, "don't walk away again." I turned to her. "I'm not walking away," I said quietly. "I'm just not walking backward." The drive home was long, the lake glimmering silver in the moonlight beside me. I rolled the window down and let the cool air wash over my face. For years I'd driven that road burdened by guilt and obligation. Now the same stretch of asphalt felt different, like the path out of something instead of toward it. Back at my apartment, I dropped my keys on the counter and stood in the stillness. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. I thought about the dinner, about the strange mix of tenderness and denial that had filled that little house. Maybe time had softened them, or maybe it had just made their masks harder to read. Either way, I knew this much: I wouldn't lose myself again trying to fix what didn't want to be mended. Before bed, I checked my phone. A text from Dad blinked on the screen. "Thanks for coming tonight. It meant a lot to your mom, and to me." I typed back a simple reply. "I'm glad you're feeling better." As I set the phone down, I caught my reflection in the window, older, steadier, but still carrying the outline of the girl who once thought love had to be earned. I whispered goodnight to the city beyond the glass and turned off the light. Somewhere in the darkness, a small sense of closure began to take shape. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to keep me moving forward. And as I drifted to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this calm was only temporary, that something unseen was still waiting just beyond the quiet. The calm didn't last. A few weeks after that dinner, I was sitting at my desk finishing a report when my phone buzzed with a text from Evan. "You might want to call Mom. She's upset." No explanation, no details. I stared at the message for a moment before deciding not to reply. For years, Mom's upset had been shorthand for drop everything and fix it. But that chapter of my life was closed. Later that night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone started ringing again, this time her name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won after a minute. Her voice trembled through the recording. "Maddie, I don't know what to do. The bank's talking about freezing our account. They said something about taxes. Please just call me back." The old panic tried to creep in, the same reflex that used to send me searching through my budget looking for what I could sacrifice. But I didn't reach for my checkbook this time. Instead, I opened my laptop, looked up the county's public records, and found the property listing for their new rental. Everything was in order. The taxes she mentioned weren't hers to pay at all. They were the landlord's responsibility. She had either misunderstood or was exaggerating again. I closed the browser and sat back staring at the rain outside my window. It hit me then that I wasn't just done helping them financially. I was done being manipulated by their emergencies. I didn't call her back. 2 days passed before Dad texted. "Can we meet for coffee? Just you and me." I hesitated, but curiosity and maybe a sliver of lingering hope won. We met at a quiet cafe near the lake, a place halfway between my apartment and their new neighborhood. When I walked in, he was already seated, hands wrapped around a mug, looking older than I remembered. He smiled faintly when he saw me. "Thanks for coming." I nodded. "What's going on?" He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Your mother's been struggling. This move, the downsizing, it's been hard on her. She misses you." I didn't answer. He continued. She doesn't mean half the things she says. You know that." "Half of them were enough," I said quietly. He looked down at his cup. "We made mistakes. We thought we were doing what was best, but maybe we leaned on you too much. It was never meant to be that way." I wanted to believe him, but something in his tone still carried that careful distance, the way he always softened responsibility until it sounded like bad luck. "You didn't lean on me, Dad," I said. "You built the house on me." He winced slightly but didn't argue. For the next few minutes we sat in silence. The smell of roasted coffee beans and rain drifted through the air. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and slid an envelope across the table. "We sold some things," he said. "It's not much, but it's yours. You helped us more than we ever thanked you for." I looked down at it but didn't touch it. "What is this supposed to fix?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "It's not about fixing," he said finally. "It's about acknowledging." That word hung between us, acknowledging. It was something I had begged for all my life, and now that it was in front of me, it felt like too little too late. I slid the envelope back toward him. "Keep it. I don't need repayment. I just need honesty." His eyes met mine for a long moment before he nodded slowly. "Then I hope someday you'll find room for forgiveness." "Maybe," I said. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." We parted on quiet terms. As I walked out, the air felt heavy but strangely clear, like a rainstorm that hadn't quite finished. A week later, I received a letter in the mail, not from my parents this time, but from the bank. It was addressed to me by mistake, probably from when I'd been listed as a co-signer years ago. The letter confirmed that my name had officially been removed from their old mortgage records. My signature wasn't needed anymore. I stared at the page for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it in my folder of documents. It felt like cutting the last thread of an old web. Around that same time, life began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. Work offered me the chance to lead a new project, a financial literacy initiative for young women starting out on their own. The irony wasn't lost on me. I accepted immediately. Teaching others how to take control of their money felt like closing a circle I hadn't realized was open. The first workshop was held at the local community center on a Saturday morning. 10 women showed up, notebooks and coffee cups in hand. I started by telling them that money wasn't just numbers. It was boundaries, freedom, and the power to say no. As I spoke, I caught glimpses of myself in their faces, anxious, determined, hopeful. By the end of the session, one of them, a young teacher named Lauren, lingered to talk. She told me she'd been paying off her parents' credit card debt for years and didn't know how to stop. "It feels cruel to say no," she said. I looked at her and said quietly, "It's not cruel to stop drowning." She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. I walked her through the steps of separating accounts, explaining what to say, how to set limits. When she left, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I think you just changed my life." I watched her go, my chest tight with something that felt like relief mixed with pride. That evening I drove home along the same lake road I'd taken so many times before. The water shimmered under the setting sun, gold rippling into blue. For years that drive had been a reminder of all the weight I carried for other people. Now it felt like a map of where I'd been and how far I'd come. A few days later, I got a voicemail from Mom again. This time, her tone was quieter, steadier. "I heard you're helping women with their finances," she said. "That's good, Maddie. Really good. I'm proud of you." It was the first time she'd ever said those words. I listened to the message twice, waiting for the catch, but it never came. I didn't call back, but I saved it. Not because I needed her approval, but because it marked something I'd stopped believing could exist growth, even if small. That night I sat by the window watching the lights from passing cars reflect on the wet streets. I thought about my father's envelope still unopened on his side of the table, and my mother's message playing softly through the speaker. I realized then that this was what change looked like, not sudden or perfect, but gradual, imperfect, and real. As I turned off the light and let the room fade into quiet, a strange peace settled over me. Not the fragile calm I'd once fought to maintain, but a steady one built from truth instead of denial. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the story, just the beginning of the part where I finally started living for myself. Spring turned to summer again, and the days grew long and golden. My work with the financial literacy program had expanded faster than I expected. What began as one small Saturday workshop turned into a partnership with 3 community centers across the county. Every week, I met women of every age, teachers, nurses, young mothers, retirees, all trying to reclaim control over lives that had been quietly drained by obligation. I didn't tell them my full story, but they saw enough of it in my eyes. Each session reminded me how many people lived under the same unspoken weight I'd carried for years. One evening after class, a woman named Diane lingered as the others packed up. She was in her 50s kind, but nervous, holding a folded letter she'd brought for advice. "It's from my daughter," she said. "She's angry because I asked for help with rent. I didn't mean to upset her." She handed it to me, and I read the gentle but firm note her daughter had written, one that sounded painfully familiar. I looked at Diane and said quietly, "She's not angry. She's trying to stop drowning." Diane's eyes filled, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. That night I walked home feeling something shift inside me. For years I had believed that stepping away made me selfish. Now I understood it was what allowed me to stand tall enough to help others. A few days later I received another message from Mom, short, formal, almost timid. "Your father's checkups have been good. We're grateful for that. He'd love to see you if you have time." I read it twice before replying simply, "I'll stop by next week." When Saturday came, I drove out to their rental near the lake. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where mailboxes leaned slightly, and everyone mowed their lawns on the same day. Their house looked small but cared for potted flowers on the steps, a wind chime hanging near the porch. Dad answered the door. He looked stronger, though his hair had thinned more than I remembered. "You came," he said, with a smile that didn't try too hard. Mom was in the kitchen stirring soup, her back to me. "I made your favorite," she said without turning around. For a moment, I thought of all the dinners that had ended in arguments, all the silences that used to fill these moments. But today the air felt still tentative but calm. We ate quietly, talking about ordinary things, his new doctor, her garden, the classes I'd been teaching. When she finally asked, "You're really helping other women learn about money?" I nodded. Yes. Mostly women who've been told it's not their place to handle it. She looked down at her bowl, stirring slowly. "That's how I was raised too," she said after a pause. "When we married, I didn't know how to read a bank statement. Your father handled everything. I just trusted it would work out." Dad gave a small nod, his voice low. "We both made mistakes, Maddie. You shouldn't have had to clean them up." The words caught me off guard. They weren't dramatic or heavy, just honest. That honesty was new. "I'm glad you're seeing that," I said quietly. After dinner, we sat on the porch watching the sky darken over the water. Crickets started their nightly rhythm, and the sound of a neighbor's television floated through an open window. For once, no one was filling the silence with blame or guilt. It was just 3 people sharing the same air, trying in their own imperfect ways to start over. Before I left, Mom walked me to the car. The porch light flickered behind her, catching in her hair. "You've done well," she said softly. "I know we haven't said it enough. We were proud before, even if we didn't show it." I met her eyes, searching for the part of her that might truly mean it. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." The drive home felt lighter than I expected. For years, I'd imagined that closure would come in a single conversation, one big reckoning that solved everything. But as the miles passed under the wheels, I realized that life didn't work that way. Sometimes healing came in fragments, a few honest words, a quiet dinner, a night without shouting. Over the next months, we settled into a new rhythm. Dad called once a week to check in, never asking for money or favors. Mom sent the occasional message about her garden or a new recipe she was trying. We weren't close, not in the way some families are, but the sharp edges had dulled. The chaos that once defined us had finally gone still. One afternoon in early fall, I hosted a new workshop downtown. This one was larger, 50 women local press coverage, even a small grant from the city. As I stood at the front of the room, I caught sight of 2 familiar faces near the back. My parents. Mom was clutching her purse like it was an anchor. Dad gave me a faint nod when our eyes met. For a moment my throat tightened, but I continued. I talked about freedom, the kind that comes from knowing your worth, your limits, and your boundaries. I told them that sometimes the hardest act of love is saying no, even to the people who raised you. I didn't look at my parents again, but I could feel their quiet attention in the room. When the session ended, they waited by the door, letting others file past before approaching. Mom reached out first, her voice low. "That was powerful," she said. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that. Dad nodded beside her. "We're proud of you, Maddie. Truly proud." The words were simple, but they didn't feel hollow this time. I smiled, and for the first time in years I believed them. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in the empty hall under the soft glow of the overhead lights. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who thought love meant fixing everything, who believed silence was strength. She would have never imagined standing here whole and calm with her family, finally seeing her for who she really was. Outside, the city lights reflected off the damp pavement, and a gentle wind moved through the trees. I packed up my things and locked the door, stepping into the cool night air. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter, the hum of traffic, the faint sound of music drifting from a nearby cafe. It all blended into something steady and real, the sound of a life I'd built on my own terms. When I got home, I placed my notes on the table and looked around the apartment. The space that once felt temporary now carried the weight of peace. On the counter sat a small vase of flowers sent that morning with no card, just a note that read, "For your next class. Keep changing lives." The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I simply placed the note beside my coffee mug, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window watching the lights shimmer across the city. Somewhere between the past and the present, a quiet kind of justice had found its way home. And though the story between us wasn't finished, I could feel the ending taking shape, one built not on guilt or duty, but on truth, forgiveness, and a peace that had finally learned how to stay. That night I left the note from my mother propped beside the vase of flowers on my counter. The city outside was calm, the kind of quiet that hums instead of rests. I made tea, sat by the window, and thought about everything that had happened, the shouting, the silence, the slow rebuilding that neither side had expected. For the first time, the memories didn't sting. They felt like old photographs, edges, worn colors, softened, impossible to hate. Over the next few months, life kept unfolding gently. My workshops grew. The small team I'd trained began teaching their own classes, and for the first time, I wasn't the only one holding the microphone. Watching other women find their voices was like seeing light pass through water. It changed shape, but never dimmed. I'd become the person I used to need, and that was something I carried quietly like a secret kind of victory. Every so often, Dad would call on Sunday afternoons. Our talks were short but steady updates about his health, the weather by the lake, or a recipe he and Mom had tried together. The tension that once filled every pause had faded. We didn't pick apart the past anymore. We simply let time do what it does best, sand down the rough edges. One weekend, I drove out to visit them again. The air was crisp, the first hint of autumn curling through the trees. Mom greeted me at the door, her hands dusted with flour, her apron smeared with pie filling. She laughed softly, almost shyly, and said, "You're just in time." Dad was setting the table, humming an old tune I hadn't heard in years. It felt strange and familiar all at once, like returning to a song you used to love before you knew what its lyrics meant. We ate, we talked, and when it was time to leave, Mom handed me a container of leftovers wrapped in foil. "I know you don't need it," she said, "but I like knowing you'll eat something I made." I smiled and took it. That small exchange, simple, almost ordinary, meant more than any apology could have. It was her way of saying she'd stopped seeing me as her lifeline and started seeing me as her daughter again. Back home, I placed the pie in the fridge, washed my hands, and stood by the window with the city stretching below me. The same skyline that once made me feel small now made me feel infinite. The apartment, once temporary, had become home, a space built on peace, not permission. I realized then that justice in my story hadn't come from punishment or revenge. It came quietly through boundaries that held and truths that stayed spoken. It came the day I decided that love should never cost my peace. My family hadn't transformed overnight, and neither had I. But we'd learned to meet halfway, no longer bound by old debts, only by the shared wish to live differently. Sometimes healing doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it's just learning to coexist without reopening the wound. And sometimes it's as simple as finding joy where there used to be survival. These days, I walk to work with a lighter step. I smile at strangers. I keep fresh flowers by the window. And every now and then when I see a woman hesitating before taking a leap for herself, I tell her what I wish someone had told me years ago: you are allowed to stop giving what costs you everything. That truth took me a long time to learn, but it's the reason I wake up grateful every morning. Not because life is perfect, but because I finally know what peace feels like when it belongs to me. If you've ever had to rebuild your life piece by piece, I hope this story reminds you you're not broken. You're just becoming whole in your own time. And if it resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a little reminder too. Sometimes all we need is to hear that it's okay to let go and start living again.